Good evening. How are you doing tonight? I'm here to refute the claim that Linux is inherently more secure than Windows for business applications, with the secondary claims that file sharing services, which are critical for businesses as their databases must be accessible between multiple of servers on Linux, are more secure than similar ones for Windows. And 3, because of Linux open source nature, vulnerabilities are found and patched at a much faster pace. Therefore, Linux install is less likely to be hacked. A couple of seeds I like to plant first, though. The net market share of both of these softwares, Windows has an 85.5% market share, and Linux has a 0.95 market share. So there's 85.5 or 85 times more users of Windows than there are of Linux. And the other little seed I like to plant is Willie Sutton was a bank robber, and when he was caught by the FBI and asked, "Why do you rob banks?" Because that's where the money is. The advocate claimed, used the CERT, which is a computer emergency rating team, which analyzes viruses, and he stated that Windows had a 94.5 and 94.5 and 78% vulnerability rating. Those were the highest scores. What CERT does is they take an average. So the actual number for Windows vulnerability is 54.67. Comparison to Linux, which is 28.48. Now keep in mind that 85 more users use Linux or Windows than Linux. Secondly, file sharing services and downloads and vulnerabilities on Linux are inherently more secure. When you download this operating systems, Windows already has accessibility to all of your printers, servers, scanners. The operating system is already understood. When you download a Linux operating system, you have to go to the Linux site to download the drivers for each of these systems because they're not applied. So there's an inherent vulnerability there already because you're having to download outside software to drive your business applications. And thirdly, Linux open source nature, because of Linux open source nature, vulnerabilities are found and patched at a much faster pace. Therefore, Linux install is less likely to be hacked. Well, I don't know about you, but when I leave my house, I usually close the windows and lock the door. I don't leave it open. Now, Peter Nicholas, a security report on Windows versus Linux, stated that Windows only suffers so many attacks because there are more Windows installations than Linux. Therefore, Linux would be just as vulnerable if it had as many installations. 2, open source is inherently less secure because malicious hackers can find flaws more easily. 3, there are more security alerts for Linux than for Windows. Therefore, Linux is less secure than Windows. Now, refuting the claim that Linux is inherently more secure than Windows for business applications, I want to close with Benjamin D. Thomas, which is the spokesman for Linux Security. Now, they have a newsletter that they have updated on a weekly basis, and the reason for this is the purpose of this document is to provide our readers with a quick summary of each week's most relevant Linux security headlines. Hence, if they have to update their site on a weekly basis for security threats, that's telling me that Linux is not inherently more secure than Windows for business applications, and I hope you agree with me. Thank you.
It always zips by, doesn't it?
All right, I thought that you did a good job at the beginning setting up the argument, and the whole issue about market share drives a lot of the issues that you're talking about subsequently, and that makes some sense. You give a pretty good explanation of that before you get to the individual claims. It was a little bit confusing, though, when you get to those claims, because I wasn't sure you signposted the first claim as clearly, and then when you got to the other claims, basically you're repeating the advocate's claim, and sometimes I thought, well, wait a second, are you making the claim, or is this the claim the advocate made? And so that was a little bit confusing, but usually it sorted itself out. And I thought you had very clear explanations about why the systems that you're talking about are not necessarily inherently more vulnerable, and why there are problems with the Linux system as well. You give pretty reasonable explanations on some of those points. I like the idea about on that third point where you're talking about the open source being potentially vulnerable, and you have that nice analogy that you make. Hey, when I leave my house, I close the doors and windows of my house. I think you need to explain how the Linux open system, for instance, creates that vulnerability because everybody has access to the code that's being used there, which makes it easier to manipulate. I think that's kind of the inference that's being made there. I did kind of enjoy the alternative interpretation that you had of the weekly security message at the end. Let's face it, there are multiple ways of reading data, and you, in essence, have taken it and read it in a completely different way than the advocate probably would have read that same information. And the inference that you're making there, I think, is pretty good. Plus, when you combine that with the argument that you made at the beginning that, look, the Microsoft sources are seen as more vulnerable because there's 85 times as many of them, I thought that that was a pretty good argument. The one thing that I think was a little bit confusing is when you do talk about the cert, and it's the same score issue that the advocate had. I didn't think that the scoring is explained very clearly, and so it's a little hard to tell if those averages represent greater vulnerability because of the argument you're talking about, because there are 85 times more or not, or if that's been accounted for in those comparisons. And that's maybe the one place where the argument has a little bit more problem. All right. Thank you.